Most agents think the job of a CMA is to figure out what a home is worth, and that's the wrong way to look at it. Homes don't have a single price like a stock or a loaf of bread. They sell within a range. And where they land inside that range depends on strategy, not guesses. My name is Levi Jones. I'm the founder and head coach of Guerrilla Realty, and I want to show you how we use our Bulletproof CMA process not to pick a number, but to help sellers make a clear, confident decision about how they want to sell without arguing, without second guessing, and without relying on gut instinct. If you've ever felt unsure presenting a price or had a seller push back no matter how good your comps were, this framework will change how you run every listing appointment. Quick sidebar, we do a full 1-hour live training on our Bulletproof CMA process, and we include the tool I'll show you, scripts, as well as the simple strategy for generating regular CMA requests. All you have to do is like this video, share it with another agent, and then comment shared below. I'll send you a private link to the full resource. First, we'll talk about how pricing isn't the decision, strategy is. And most sellers think the CMA is about finding the price, but it's not. Pricing is the output, not the decision. The real decision is how you want to sell, fast, aggressive, or somewhere in between. And until you define that, any number you pick is just a guess. So let's actually talk about what a pricing strategy is. And in fact, the traditional CMA is what most agents use. This is what we're all taught. This is going to sound really familiar to you. But basically, it starts with the question, what's the home worth? Okay. Now, when we start with that question, we then begin to do a series of activities. And again, this will look very familiar to you if you've done real estate in the last 30 years. Okay. We draw a circle around the house, and it might be a half a mile or a mile radius or whatever it is that's normal in your area. But we draw a big circle around our subject property. Then we go and find 3 and 4 closed comps. Now, some agents are really thorough, and they also find 3 or 4 active comps. After they've done that, they then throw out any that they don't like, right? And you guys have done it. Don't smile. You know you've done it. But we throw out the ones we don't like. Why? Because, that doesn't really support the value that we want. And then we apply some weird voodoo to adjust for finishes. And if you've been around the business for a while, you actually may remember the sheets that they would post in our offices that would say, hey, adjust X amount of dollars for granite countertops or this or that. And some of you are like, I don't use that. That's silly. That's what the old school agents. No, you still use it. You use it in the form of RPR, Cloud CMA. They do the traditional CMA, and they just put a nice software skin on it. Now, the single price strategy, which is really what we're talking about when we start with the question, what's the home worth? It's prone to really creating conflict with your seller because sellers anchor in emotionally. You all know this. When they already have a price in mind that they want, maybe it comes from their neighbors, maybe they just, hey, I'd love to get $100,000 equity out of this house or whatever the case may be. Of course, we defend our own opinions, right? Because we're somewhat anchored emotionally. We've decided that traditional CMA, which, by the way, is pretty unscientific. It's based on a really small margin of small number of data points, which means by definition, statistically, the margin of error is very, very high. But we still defend our opinions like it's good as gold. And then what oftentimes happen after the fact is that a weak appraisal or market feedback, it creates these surprises. And that's what causes conflict in our seller relationships. Wouldn't it be great if we could avoid all that? So we use a Bulletproof CMA, and we start with a completely different question. Instead of what's the home worth, that's going to be part of it. But instead of that being the central question, we actually want to start with the question, what outcomes are available? Because we're doing this CMA so that we can help serve our sellers by selling their home, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to do a 50-point statistical analysis. More data points, smaller margin of error. Again, it's a statistical truth. Homes don't have one price. Instead, we found that they have a reasonable range of value, and it's based on the demand, the time, and the exposure that a property gets. Now, when we think about it through that prism, it completely changes the way we do our valuation and ultimately the way we're going to present it to the customer. Once you understand that price is a strategy choice, the question becomes what data actually defines those options? And that's where most CMAs fall apart. The Bulletproof CMA, on the other hand, uses 3 different data sources, each accurate on its own, to define a real defensible range of outcomes. Source number 1 is the adjusted baseline valuation. Again, we have a tool that walks through all of this, but we're going to start with a baseline valuation that can come from either a recent appraisal, a recent sale, or the tax assessed value. Now, the most common of these that I typically use in my Bulletproof CMA is the tax assessed value because I oftentimes don't have a recent sale or a recent appraisal to go by. Once we have that, though, we're not just going to take the tax assessed value as is. We're going to bring it forward with the market appreciation. So we're going to adjust it forward. Now, remember, this is just one data point. So you might go, well, I don't know if I trust the tax assessed value. Guess what? I don't by itself either. But this is just one data point that we're going to bring into a comprehensive statistical analysis. And this is what it looks like in our tool. You're going to start with the baseline value. You're going to put in the data valuation. And then there's actually a little tool that allows you to calculate the property appreciation. You do have to have MLS access, but you don't have to go searching for the appreciation. You can actually calculate it on your own. It's really simple. Once you have that appreciation rate, it will then give you an adjusted baseline valuation. And again, that's the first data point, the first source that we use here. Source number 2 is active comparables. We want to see what's actually on the market right now, which of course is the most recent data points that we have. And we're going to start out with something we call the broad match comparables. So when I say broad match, I don't mean it doesn't have to be an exact match, but we do want to have beds and baths match as well as a match of the subdivision or community that it's in. So again, rural properties may not be in a subdivision, but will be in a community that you can suss out. And as you're choosing these broad match comparables, I want you to include similar rather than contiguous communities. What I mean by that is we don't draw a circle around our subject property. Instead, and the reason why is because oftentimes subdivisions are right next to other subdivisions which are not at all comparable. They're not built in the same time frame. They have completely different demographics that live there. And so what we're going to find much more beneficial in terms of finding good broad match comparables is we're going to find similar neighborhoods that may be 5 miles away, 10 miles away, across town, whatever the case may be, but similar subdivisions and find broad match comparables there. Again, when you're using our Bulletproof CMA tool, which again, you can access at bulletproofcma.com, we're going to then find an average list price. We're going to look for at least 12 comps, but the more you can find is the better. And if we need to include additional communities in order to get that number, that baseline number of 12 comps, we will do that before we move on to the final source, which is closed comps. Now, closed comps are going to be similar to the active comps. In other words, we're going to use the exact same broad match criteria. However, sometimes we can have difficulty finding the data points we need, and we need at least 36 closed comps. You may be going, how the heck am I going to get 36? Well, one of the things that we're going to throw out the window is this idea that we have to be super current, that we have to have comps that are within 3 months or 6 months or some other arbitrarily short time frame. The reason why I say that's arbitrary is because the reason why people use the comps that are within a small time range is those are the most recent, the most accurate. As you go farther back, they're not accurate. Why? Because they don't account for appreciation. What if we did adjust for appreciation? The tool does that, by the way. And so you're going to put in the same broad match comparables. You're going to put in the average sale price. You're going to calculate the appreciation from back as far back as you need to go, whether it's 3 months or 12 months or 48 months. You're going to calculate the appreciation from 48 months ago. And currently, our tool will automatically adjust that number forward so that you have an accurate valuation. You put those three sources together, and now you have a good starting point for a reasonable range of value. Here's where this all comes together. When you stop presenting a single price and start presenting a range of outcomes, the conversation completely changes. Sellers stop arguing about their home is worth, and then they start choosing which strategy makes the most sense for them. This is a copy of the report that's generated after we complete the Bulletproof CMA. And this is how we present it to the seller. You'll notice there's a quick graphic here, and I'll go into that in a minute. But then we actually have a range of numbers from our adjusted baseline, from our active, from our closed comps. We don't have a single valuation. Now, yes, there's a suggested list price, and I'll make my case for why that would be the strategy we want to use, is to list it at that price. But we're not going to land on that price and then get into an argument with the seller. And I'm going to show you the graphic at the top in a little bit more detail, but I want you to remember two things, okay? The first thing I want you to remember is that more price, in other words, if we want to achieve a higher price, we have to have more demand, more buyers to see it. And generally, this happens over time. If you don't have some sort of intervention to drive demand or drive buyers, this will just naturally happen over time. More and more people will see it the longer it's on the market. But the second thing I want you to remember is that time on market is not a failure. It's just a variable, okay? So we know there's this reasonable range of value, this range in which most people would say both the buyers and the sellers are getting a fair deal so long as the home sells within this range. The question is, where within this range should this fall? And different sellers will have different motivations. Some of them really just want to squeeze every last dollar out of their home, and they're willing to let it sit on the market for some time. Maybe they already have it paid off, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of different motivations, right? Unfortunately, most agents usually take the tactic and they assume that we just want to sell it as quick as possible. And so usually that means lowering the price. And so the reasonable range of value, you'll notice that there's an x-axis here, which is the days on market. Over time, you would see more and more people see the property. In other words, the demand is built over time. At the very high end of the reasonable range, you would typically assume that there would be more than normal, a higher than normal number of people that would need to see it in order to achieve that high end of the reasonable range. At the average, sort of in the middle of the reasonable range, you would say, hey, this needs to have an average number of people see it. And then at the low end of the reasonable range, we only need to have a few people see it before we find someone who really wants to buy it at that price. Again, this usually happens naturally over days on market, but the truth is you could even continue to raise the price and the days on market would go out. Now, when you think of it this way, again, it means that time is just a variable, and we can adjust the time based on the seller's priorities. We can adjust the strategy we use based on the seller's priorities. Here's the beauty of this. We almost completely eliminate objections when we frame it this way. And I'll just go through a few, but this will immediately ring true to you. What about that objection you always get? Hey, I actually think my home is worth X. Okay, well, let's talk about it. Is it within the reasonable range of value? If it's not, why? You tell me, what is it about your house that takes it out of this reasonable range of value? And, do you have the same motivation as your neighbor? My neighbor's home sold for X. Okay, great. Do you have the same motivation? Are you willing to sacrifice price in the interest of time? Or do you want to let it sit on the market a little bit longer? And then, of course, everybody's favorite objection is the Zestimate. The Zestimate says, again, it eliminates this objection when you begin talking about price and time as simply variables within the strategy that you're ultimately using. So let's talk strategy for just a moment. I actually think that framing it this way leads brilliantly to talking about our strategy, which we call the traffic approach. It's really a choice between two yeses because, again, we present two strategies and we say, hey, I'm more than comfortable listing it at using either strategy depending on what your motivations are. So as an example, our traffic approach, which we've talked about in another video, I'll link it above. But our traffic approach we actually raise the price to the upper end of the reasonable range. And you would normally think, well, that means it's going to sit on the market a little bit, but we're going to induce demand. We're going to use an exterior force to induce demand with the bribe. The bribe is the exterior force that artificially induces this demand. Now, again, we're able to achieve a low days on market with the high end of the reasonable range because we get the demand not just by letting it sit on the market, but by bribing real estate agents. The price approach, and quite frankly, this is what most agents use, is, hey, we're going to put it at the low end of the reasonable range. We're going to try to sell it quickly. And it really only prioritizes speed. In fact, you saw this all day when the market was super hot a couple of years ago and agents were throwing signs in the yard, and then they were bragging about selling it within a day. Again, they were prioritizing speed. And the truth is, almost none of them were getting absolute top dollar for their price. And it makes sense. Of course, by definition, they didn't get top dollar because they sold it so quickly. It's just the way it works. They weren't doing anything special to induce a higher than average demand or anything like that. Let me show you the graph of how it might look like. What if instead of the previous graph, where we had the low end of the price at the left side of the days on market, we were able to drive a lot of traffic by offering a premium buyer agent commission, and we were able to get a lot of people looking at it. Therefore, we could achieve that high end of the reasonable range. That's the strategy we use. I really hope this helps reframe the way you go into your next listing presentation. Letting your potential seller start with a choice between two yeses is an absolute game changer. Remember, we did a private 1-hour training on our full Bulletproof CMA process. We share the tools, the step-by-step, the scripts, everything you need to begin using a CMA that you can actually feel confident in. Just like the video, share it with a friend to help us beat the algorithm, then comment below that you knocked it all out. After you do that, we'll send a link to the private training. Thanks. We'll see you soon.